When we think about the Holy Spirit, we think about what it means to believe that God Himself is at work in our lives. Not only about what God does for us, but also about what God does in us. Both of these are key to what Christian discipleship is about. Just before Jesus ascended into heaven, He gathered His disciples together, and He said to them, "You will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria, and to the end of the earth." Disciples of Jesus are not simply updated versions of the disciples of Moses or the disciples of the Pharisees who lived according to the law. The disciples of the law were empowered by their own human spirit, in other words, by their own righteousness and obedience to the standards set by God and subject to their own human traditions. What empowered their actions was a desire to achieve a higher moral status. They wanted to be able to show that they were better than all the others who followed the law. The way the law works is a you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours proposition. It is a transactional bargain based on the premise that if you follow God's commandments, God, in turn, will reward you for your obedience. The law assumes a back-and-forth reciprocity in our relationship with God, where we do our part for God, and then God does His part for us. In a law-based discipleship model, each party fulfills their obligation in a divine and human contract. In such a law-based scenario, the Holy Spirit is not present or required. When it comes to following Jesus, some Christians use the same back-and-forth logic of the law. Recognizing that God is the one who takes the initiative in grace, they define discipleship by simply changing the order of the transaction, saying, "Because God has done all this for us, we must now do this for God." In such a view, works of discipleship and lives of obedience are not required preconditions for God's grace, but they are disguised as necessary post-conditions in a sort of retroactive transaction, as if that is somehow better. Discipleship is understood to be a no money down, no payments until January sort of bargain, but all parties are aware that eventually the bill must be paid. The law is still the law. The gospel, however, is not simply a pay-after-the-fact deal. The good works produced by faith are not our human settlement of delayed payment plan. Rather, the good that is produced by faith is fruit of God's own Holy Spirit at work in us. The logic of the gospel is not like the transactional logic of the law that says, if you do this for God, God will do this for you. Nor is the gospel merely the same law in reverse that says, if God does this for you, you must do this for God. The gospel, from start to finish, is the work of God's Holy Spirit, both for us and in us. Our lives of discipleship are not our payback for God's prior grace, but our lives in which the very Spirit of God is at work through us. Discipleship is not an act of our own human will in payment of debt. It is the active expression of God's own will being done by God in and among us. We are simply the earthen vessels. The transcendent power belongs to God. Take, for example, a carpenter and the hammer. The hammer does not pay back the carpenter by doing its own work apart from the carpenter's hand. The hammer is used by the carpenter to do his work. In the same way, we are simply tools in the carpenter's hand. Just as God uses the physical sacraments as His means of grace, God uses our lives as His disciples in a sacramental way to convey His grace and love to others. When Martin Luther made his famous statement in the Small Catechism saying, "I cannot by my own understanding or strength believe in Jesus Christ my Lord or come to Him, but the Holy Spirit has called, gathered, enlightened, and sanctified the whole Christian church on earth," He was not merely speaking of justification or simply the grace by which we are saved, nor was he speaking of some prevenient deposit of grace for which we must later pay in full. He was speaking of sanctification and the power of the Holy Spirit, past, present, and future, by which we are made holy before God. All this is the fruit of God's own Holy Spirit. As Jesus spoke to his disciples the words we hear in Acts chapter 1, he was not speaking of our work in response to God. He was speaking of the work that God himself does and will do in us by the power of the Holy Spirit. With Luther, then, we make our confession of faith, that to be disciples of Jesus Christ is not something we do, but it is the work of the Holy Spirit living and active within us. It is not our will, but the will of the one at work in us.